My name is Sutter. I'm an entrepreneurship professor at Miami University of Ohio. The motivation for this paper really kind of sprung from some policy discussions and academic discussions around encouraging informal entrepreneurs to formalize. That's seen as a very positive thing. It's seen as leading to economic development. Formal entrepreneurs can engage in more robust markets. They contribute to a tax base. There's a lot of good things. And a lot of that discussion is really centered around the rates, tax rates, the costs and benefits of complying with regulation, and whether or not entrepreneurs see the value in formalization. So informal entrepreneurs operate without legal licenses. They're considered legitimate in the markets in which they operate. And we see this across all kinds of countries, developed countries and developing, but definitely more prevalent in developing economies, where you'll find entrepreneurs operating outside the boundaries of the formal regulatory environment. And so there's interest in how do we take these informal entrepreneurs and facilitate their transition to formal entrepreneurs. But this discussion has really centered around the economic obstacles, so the costs of registering your firm, the complications of registering your firm, whether or not entrepreneurs perceive any tangible benefits from doing that in terms of property rights protections or other advantages. Our observations that led to the motivation for this study really centered around the fact that that's true in some cases. Let's say if you're a shopkeeper in a developing country, you might on the same street find informal shopkeepers and formal shopkeepers. You frequently do. But in other industries and other areas, and we're looking at the context of agriculture, you find two completely different markets. You'll find a market for formal goods, and you'll find a market for informal goods. And it turns out that these markets have different quality standards, they have different ways of doing business, and so the transition from informality to formality involves a lot more than a little bit of paperwork. And in fact, it frequently involves a third party, what we term an institutional, and others have termed an institutional intermediary, that helps facilitate the transition from informality to formality. And so our motivation in studying this topic was, how does that occur? How does a third party, an NGO, a non-governmental organization, work as an institutional intermediary? How do they act to formalize or help formalize these small informal entrepreneurs? The approach to this research was qualitative in nature. We decided that we really needed to understand the context in a deep way. We really needed to spend a lot of time on the ground. And so we focused on the Nicaraguan dairy industry. And we found a context where there was a large non-governmental organization acting as an institutional intermediary. And they were trying to help these farmers, about 1,800 farmers over a period of several years, switch from informal markets, operating informally, to formal markets. And there were vast differences between these two markets. So on the informal market, the farmers would see the business as a lifestyle, as a tradition, a way of life, a culture. They didn't evaluate things in a business sense at all. They would sell their milk on the informal market. It would go to an informal cheese producer, and they would turn it into cheese with really no quality standards associated with it, and other than just taste and fat content. But in terms of hygiene or other things, there was no regulatory body overseeing this cheese being sold, and then that would just get sold in the village market. And what the NGO's goal was to help these farmers transition to where they were selling to formal buyers of milk. And these buyers wanted high quality milk. They wanted much larger quantities. So instead of 10 liters or 20 liters, they wanted to buy 3,000 liters, 10,000 liters. And it required an entirely different set of capabilities, an entirely different set of practices. And so what we did was we went in there multiple times over multiple years, multiple waves of data collection, and talked to the farmers and observed what was happening as the NGO would work with them, would try to convince them, would try to train them, would try to work with them so they could transition from this informal market over to the formal market. The findings were really fascinating, and to me anyway, and hopefully to others, and really complicated. The initial sense was, my goodness, they're paying 3 times the price on the formal market for milk. This should be a no-brainer. The entrepreneur should just jump right over to the formal markets because they can earn 3 times as much per liter on their milk. Instead, we found all these barriers, and they range from simple and small things, like the NGO says, hey, you've got to wash your hands before you milk a cow. And the farmer pushes back and says, are you kidding? Everybody knows that washing your hands makes your hands cold, milking cows makes your hands hot, and everybody knows that gives you arthritis. So just all the way along the chain, there was this pushback. We found pushback so that was sort of at a cognitive or a cultural level, and in terms of the ingrained beliefs and ways of viewing the farm. In terms of their networks, I mean, we even found cases in some of the remote areas where the farmers would say, you know, my neighbors, they really don't like this. They see this as me trying to get ahead of them or move past them, increase my status. We found cases where the neighbors would come in and burn their fields at night. So there was resistance across the social networks. And of course, the informal buyers, the cheesemakers, they didn't like this at all. They were losing their base of cheap milk to create informal cheese. And so there was just resistance kind of at every step of the way. So we found what the NGO did, sometimes intentionally, sometimes it just sort of worked out. I should say that this case was really mixed in terms of the success. Some areas went really well and some went really poorly, and so it gave us a lot of variance to kind of understand the process. But in the places where it worked well, what we found was there were interventions at the cognitive level, so they would help them understand the farm in new and different ways. There were interventions at the network level. They would build new social networks, so the farmers didn't just rely on their next door neighbor for advice or their family or their political affiliations or their religious affiliations, but actually could start to meet farmers they'd never met before across 10 kilometers away, but farmers who were also interested in making these changes, and it gave them the social support they needed to make this transition. We also found that they had to implement a whole brand new series of rules and systems and regulations in place. So they had to introduce quality testing. They had to make sure that the milk had good fat content. They had to make sure that the bacteria count was low. They had to make sure that it met the quality standards. And together, these individual level interventions, these network level interventions, and these kind of systemic level interventions created what we termed institutional scaffolding. And so it was this scaffolding that would bridge the entrepreneurs from the informal institutional environment, the informal market where they're used to operating, over to the formal institutional market. And there were a couple of attributes of this scaffolding that were really, really important, and I think this is where a lot of the practical implications for the study come out. Number one, the scaffolding, it had to be complete. There was lots of interdependence in the scaffolding. So if you created a new network, but you didn't trigger a new way of thinking about the farm, the scaffolding would fall apart. Or if you triggered a new way of thinking and you built a new network, but you didn't put the rules in place, the monitoring and the enforcement mechanisms, it would fall apart. And sometimes with really bad consequences. We saw one case where the NGO came in, the farmers were enthusiastic, they started selling to the formal buyer, but they didn't have the rules and the monitoring and enforcement in place very well. And so the milk didn't meet the quality standards. The multinational buyer quit buying that milk. The farmers needed then to revert back to the informal market, and the informal cheese buyer said, guess what? No. We're now going to punish you for several months. We're not going to buy from you, or we're going to buy at drastically reduced prices to punish you for going outside of our supply chain. And so this sense of completeness really, really mattered. You had to make sure that you hit all the levels, and you had to make sure that it occurred in a proper temporal sequence. So there were changes some changes needed to come first, some needed to come second, and the timing was critical. As I explained in that example right there, if you didn't have everything in place by the time the farmers were ready to make the jump, then it could all fall apart on you. So we saw the constructing this scaffolding was critical for success, and the construction of the scaffolding was both interdependent and temporally sensitive. We really hope that this paper starts to inform our understanding of what informality really means, and that we can take a broader lens, that we can build on some of the work that understands informality not just as legal registration, but actually as a mechanism of internal control for the firm, as a way of relating with others. It requires a whole distinct set of capabilities, a whole different way of doing business. And some of those practices, I think, are relevant for formal firms in developed economies. In Silicon Valley, there's a lot that could be learned from informal firms and the ways that they operate. And also, it's really critical for the policy discussion around how do we help farmers formalize. The discussion, again, is kind of centered around tax, and do we lower tax rates, or do we make formalization easier? Yes, we do. That's critical, right? But that may not be enough. That's maybe necessary but not sufficient. We really need to understand the markets that they're trying to operate, the capabilities required for operating in those markets, and the institutional infrastructure you need behind new ways of operating if we're going to build more inclusive markets, if we're going to be able to reach out across and integrate some of these people who have been marginalized for so long.